Hi, Galen. Dad, here. I'm going to read another story from Peter Pan, which is Peter Pan and Wendy. If you remember, in the last chapter, we saw the pirates get ready to capture all the children, and all the pirates were waiting by all the trees, ready to grab them as they came out. And the pirates pretended they were the Redskins, so the lost boys would come out of the tree. So I wonder what's going to happen. I think it's going to be pretty exciting, but scary. Anyway, if you're not ready, it's time to cuddle up. Get in bed. You're in bed already. Okay. Cuddle up. Give Mum a big cuddle. Good. Okay. Let's begin. So it's chapter 13. Do you believe in fairies? Do you? I think I believe in fairies. Otherwise, what would happen to Tink? That's good. The more quickly this horror is disposed of, the better. The first to emerge from the tree was Curly. He rose out of it into the arms of Seagull, who flung him to Smee, who flung him to Starkey, who flung him to Bill Jukes, who flung him to Noodler, and so he was tossed from one another till he fell at the feet of the Black Pirate. All the boys were plucked from their trees in this ruthless manner, and several of them were in the air at a time, like bales of goods flung from hand to hand. A different treatment was accorded to Wendy, who came last. With ironical politeness, Hook raised his hat to her and offered her his arm. He escorted her to the spot where the others were being gagged. He did it with such an air, he was so frightfully impossibly distinguished, that she was too fascinated to cry out. She was only a little girl. Perhaps it is a telltale to divulge that for a moment. Perhaps it is a tall tale to divulge that for a moment Hook entranced her, and we tell only because her slip led to strange results. Had she haughtily handed him, and we should have loved to write of her, she would have been hurled through the air like the others, and then Hook would probably not have been present at the tying of the children, and had he not been at the tying, he would not have discovered Slightly's secret, and without that secret he would not presently have made his foul attempt on Peter's life. Oh my God. They were tied to prevent their flying away, doubled up with their knees close to their ears, and for the trousing of them the Black Pirate had cut a rope into 9 equal pieces. All went well until Slightly's turn came, when he was found to be like those irritating parcels that used up all the string in going around and leave no tags with which to tie a knot. The pirates kicked him in rage, just as you kick the parcel, though in fairness you shouldn't kick the string. And, strange to say, it was Hook who told them to belay their violence. His lips were curled with malicious triumph, whilst his dogs were merely sweating because every time they tried to pack the unhappy lad tight in one part, he bulged out at another. Hook's mastermind had gone far beneath Slightly's surface, probing not for effect but for cause, and his exhaustion showed that he had found them. Slightly, white to the gills, knew that Hook had discovered his secret, which was this, that no boy so blown out could use a tree where an average man needs stick. Poor Slightly, most wretched of all children now, for he was in panic about Peter, bitterly regretted that he had done. Madly addicted to the drinking of water when he was hot, he had swelled in consequence to his present girth, and instead of reducing himself to fit his tree, he had, unknown to the others, bottled his tree to make it fit him. So Slightly has made the tree a lot bigger, so maybe a pirate can get down. Oh no. Sufficient of this, Hook guessed to persuade him that Peter at last lay at his mercy, but no word of the dark design that now formed in the subterranean caverns of his mind crossed his lips. He merely signalled that the captives were to be conveyed to the ship, and that he wouldn't be alone. how to convey them. Hutched up in their ropes, they might indeed be rolled downhill like a barrel, but most of the way lay through a morass. Again, Hook's guise surmounted difficulties. He indicated that the little house must be used as a conveyance. The children were flung into it. 4 stout pirates raised it on their shoulders, and others fell in behind. And, singing the hateful pirate chorus, the strange procession set off through the wood. I don't know whether any of the children were crying. If so, the singing drowned the sound. But as the little house disappeared in the forest, a brave-fought, tiny jet of smoke issued from its chimney, as if defying Hook. Hook saw it, and it did Peter a bad service. It dried up any trickle of pity for him that he may have remained in the pirate's infuriated breast. The first thing he did on finding himself alone in the fast-falling night was to tiptoe to Slightly's tree and make sure that it provided him with a passage. Then, for as long as he remained brooding, his hat or ill omen on this watchword, so that any gentle breeze with which arisen may play refreshingly through his hair. Darker were his thoughts, his blue eyes were as soft as the periwinkle. Instantly he listened for any sign from the netherworld, but all was as silent below as above. The house underground seemed to be one more empty tenement in the void. Was the boy asleep? Or did he stand waiting at the foot of Slightly's tree with his dagger in his hand? There was no way of knowing, save by going down. Hook let his cloak slip softly to the ground, and then biting his lips till a lewd plaid stood in them, he stepped into the tree. He was a brave man, but for a moment he had to stop there and wipe his brow, which was dripping like a candle. Then, silently, he let himself go into the unknown. He arrived unmolested at the foot of the shaft and stood still again, biting at his breath, which had almost left him. As his eyes became accustomed to the dim light, various objects in the home under the tree took shape, but the only one on which his greedy gaze rested, long sought for and found at last, was the great bed, and on the bed lay Peter, fast asleep. Unaware of the tragedy being enacted above, Peter had continued for a little time after the children left, to play gaily on his pipes, no doubt rather a forlorn attempt to prove to himself that he did not care. Then he decided not to take his medicine, so as to grieve Wendy. Then he lay down on the bed outside the coverlet to vex her still more, for she had always tucked him inside it, because you never knew that you may not grow chilly at the turn of the night. Then he nearly cried, but it struck him how indignant she would be if he laughed instead. So he laughed a haughty laugh and fell asleep in the middle of it. Ha 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 ha! Like that. Sometimes, though, not often, he had dreams, and they were more painful than the dreams of other boys. For hours he could not be separated from these dreams, though he wailed piteously in them. They had to do, I think, with the riddle of his existence. At such times it had been Wendy's custom to take him out of bed and sit with him on her lap, soothing him in a dear way of her own invention, and when he grew calmer to put him back to bed before he quite woke up, so that he should not know of the indignity at which she had just subjected him. But on this occasion he had fallen at once into a dreamless sleep. One arm dropped over the edge of the bed, one leg arched, and the unfinished part of his laugh was standing on his mouth, which was open, showing his little pearls. Because remember, Peter still has his baby teeth. Thus defenceless, Hook found him. He stood silent at the foot of the tree, looking across the chamber at his enemy. Did no feeling of compassion disturb his sombre breast? The man was not wholly evil. He loved flowers, I have been told, and sweet music. He was himself no mean performer on the harpsichord. And let it be frankly admitted, the idyllic nature of the scene stirred him profoundly. Mastered by his better self, he would have returned reluctantly up the tree, but for one thing. What stayed him was Peter's impatient appearance as he slept. The open mouth, the dropping arm, the arched knee, they were such personifications of cockiness as taken together will never again, one may hope, be presented to eyes so sensitive to their offensiveness. They steeled Hook's heart. If his rage had been broken into 100 pieces, every one of them would have been disregarded the incident and leapt at the sleeper. Through a light from one lamp shone dimly on the bed. Hook stood in darkness himself, and at the first stealthy step forward he discovered an obstacle, the door of Slightly's tree. It did not entirely fill the aperture, and he had been looking over it. Feeling for the catch, he found to his fury that it was low down, beyond his reach. To his disordered brain it seemed that the irritating quality in Peter's face and figure visibly increased, and he rattled the door and flung himself against it. Was his enemy to escape him after all? But what was that? The red in his eyes had caught sight of Peter's medicine standing on a ledge within easy reach. He fathomed what it was straight away, and immediately knew that the sleeper was in his power. Lest he should be taken alive, Hook always carried about his person a dreadful drug, blended by himself with all the death-dealing rings that had come into his possession. Those he had boiled down into yellow liquid, quite unknown to science, which was probably the most violent poison in existence. 5 drops of this he now added to Peter's cup. His hand shook, but it was in exultation rather than shame. As he did it, he avoided glaring at the sleeper. But not less pity should unnerve him, merely to avoid spilling. Then, one long gloating look he cast upon his victim, and turning, wormed his way with difficulty back up the tree. Donning his hat at its most rather rakish angle, he wound his cloak around him, holding one end in front of it to conceal his person from the night, of which it was the bleakest part, and muttering strangely to himself, stole away through the trees. Peter slept on. The light guttered, which was burned to the edge, and went out, leaving the treatment in darkness. But still he slept. It must have been not less than 10 o'clock by the crocodile when he suddenly sat up in his bed, wakened by what he knew not. It was a soft caution tapping on the door of his tree. Soft and cautious, but in that stillness it was sinister. Peter felt for his dagger, till his hand gripped it. Then he spoke. "Who's that?" For long there was no answer. Then again the knock. "Who are you?" No answer. He was thrilled, and he loved being thrilled. In 2 strides he reached the door. Unlike Slightly's door, it filled the apartment opening, so that he could not see beyond, nor could the one knocking see him. "I won't open unless you speak," cried Peter. Then at last the visitor spoke, in a lovely bell-like voice. "Let me in, Peter." It was Tink. And quickly he unbarred to her. She flew in excitedly, her face flushed and her dress stained with mud. "What is it?" "Oh, you never could guess," she cried, and offered him 3 guesses. "Out with it," he shouted, and in one anagrammatical sentence, as long as the ribbon that conjurers magicians pull from their mouth, she told of the capture of Wendy and the boys. Peter's heart bobbed up and down as he listened. Wendy bound, and on the pirate ship, she who loved everything to be just so. "I'll rescue her," he cried, leaping at his weapon. And as he leapt, the thought of something he could do to please her. He could take his medicine. His hand closed on the fatal draught. "No!" shrieked Tinker Bell, who had heard Hook muttered about his deeds as he sped through the forest. "Why not? It is poisoned." "Poisoned? Well, who could have poisoned it?" "Hook!" "Don't be silly. How could Hook have got in here?" Alas, Tinker Bell could not explain this, for even she did not know the dark secret of Slightly's tree. Nevertheless, Hook's word had left no room for doubt. The cup was poison. Besides, said Peter, quite believing himself, I never fell asleep. He raised the cup. No time for words now. Time for deeds. And with one of her lightning movements, Tink got between his lips and drained it to the dregs. Why, Tink, how dare you drink my medicine? But she did not answer. Already she was reeling in the air. What is the matter with you? Cried Peter, suddenly afraid. It was poison, Peter, she told him softly. And now I am going to be dead. Oh, Tink, did you drink it to save me? Yes. But why, Tink? Her wings would scarcely carry her now, but in reply she alighted to his shoulder and gave his nose a loving bite. She whispered in his ears, You silly ass, and then tottering to her chamber, lay down on the bed. His head almost filled the fourth wall of her little room as he knelt near her in distress. Every movement her light was growing fainter, and he knew that it went out she would be no more. She liked his tears so much that she put one on her beautiful finger and let them run over it. Her voice was so low that at first he could not make her out of what she said. Then he made it out. She was saying that she thought she could get well again if children believed in fairies. Peter flung out his arms. There were no children there, and it was night time, but he addressed all who might be dreaming in the Neverland, and who were therefore nearer to him than you think. Boys and girls in their nighties and naked papost on their baskets hung from the tree. Do you believe? He cried. Do you believe? Do you believe in fairies, Caleb? If you don't believe in fairies, then Tinker Bell might die. So do you believe? That's good. Tink sat up in bed almost briskly to listen to her fate. She fancied she heard answers of the affirmative, and then again she wasn't sure. What do you think? She asked Peter. If you believe, he shouted to them, clap your hands. Don't let Tink die. Did you clap your hands? Can't let Tink die. Some of the other kids dreaming of the Netherlands clapped as well, but some didn't. A few beasts hissed. The clapping stopped suddenly, as if countless mothers had rushed to their nurseries to see what on earth was happening. But already Tink was saved. First her voice grew strong, and she popped out of bed, and then she was flushing through the room, more merrily impudent than ever. She never thought of thanking those who believed, but she would have liked to get to the ones who had hissed. And now to rescue Wendy. Well done, by the way. It looks like we've saved Tinker Bell. The moon was riding in a cloudy heaven when Peter rose from his tree, belted his weapons, and wearing little else, to set out upon his perilous quest. It was not such a night as he would have chosen. He had hoped to fly, keeping not far from the ground so that nothing unwanted should escape his eyes, but in that fitful light to have flown low would have meant trailing his shadow through the trees, thus disturbing birds and acquainting a watchful foe that was to astir. He regretted now that he had given the birds of the island such strange names, that they were very wild and difficult to approach. There was no other course but to press forward in redskin fashion, to which happily he was an adept and expert. But in what direction? For he could not be sure that the children had been taken to the ship. A light fall of snow had obliterated all footmarks, and deathly silence pervaded the island. As for a space, nature stood still in horror at the recent carnage of the pirates. He had taught the children something of the forest lore that he had himself learned from the Tiger Lily and Tinker Bell, and knew that in their dire hour they were not likely to forget it. Slightly, if he had opportunity, would Braze, which is cut a mark in the trees, for instance. Curly would drop seeds, and Wendy would leave her handkerchiefs at some important place. The morning was needed to search for such guidance, and he could not wait. The upper world had called him, but he would get no help. The crocodile passed him, but not another living thing, not a sound, not a movement, and yet he still knew well the sudden death might be the next tree, or stalking him from behind. He swore his terrible oath. Hook or me, this time. Only one of us can live. Now he crawled forward like a snake, and again erected, he darted across a space on which the moonlight played, one finger on his lips and his dagger at the ready. He was frightfully happy. My God, that's the end of that chapter. That was good. Imagine Hook poisoning Peter and then Tinkerbell drinking it to save Peter's life. And then we saved Peter's life because we believed in fairies and clapped. That was really exciting. Anyway, that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is the pirate ship, which will be really good. So, if you're not already, it's time to go to sleep. Night night. Love you.